He adopted 3 homeless girls no one wanted. 18 years later, they appeared on national TV and revealed something that left the entire country speechless. Eldridge Mason wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to stop for anyone. A self-made millionaire, owner of the largest chain of auto repair shops in the South, his schedule was tightly packed and his suits always pressed to perfection. But that December evening, as he left a board meeting and his car rolled past a desolate part of downtown Savannah, something made him slam the brakes. There they were, 3 girls, huddled under a broken bus shelter, wrapped in tattered blankets and shivering. The oldest couldn't have been more than 11. One of them held a cardboard sign with messy handwriting, "Not asking for money. Just hungry." He stared for a long moment through the tinted window, while his driver, Silas, looked back uneasily. "Sir, should I drive on?" Eldridge didn't respond. Instead, he opened the door himself, stepping into the cold. The girls flinched. The middle one, with wild, curly red hair, clenched her jaw like she was ready to fight him off with a broken bottle. But Eldridge simply knelt in front of them. "What are your names?" he asked softly. They hesitated, looking at each other. Finally, the smallest one whispered, "Tully." The redhead mumbled, "Zadie." And the oldest, eyes hard and haunted, said, "Marlowe." He asked if they were alone. They nodded. No parents, no relatives, just each other. Eldridge didn't ask any more questions. He took off his long wool coat and wrapped it around the smallest girl. Then he turned to Silas. "We're taking them to the house." That night, chaos erupted behind the gates of the Mason estate. Staff protested. Lawyers were called. His personal assistant begged him to reconsider. "Sir, this is not a good look for a man of your profile. You'll be investigated." "The media." "I don't care about the media," Eldridge snapped. "I care about 3 little girls who haven't eaten in 2 days." He had rooms prepared. Called in a private pediatrician. Ordered warm meals. But when he knocked on their guest room door later that night, he found them all curled up in the same bed, wide-eyed and unable to sleep. They didn't trust the house, the warmth, or the man who gave it to them. Not yet. That night, as snow started to fall, Eldridge sat in his study, staring at an old photo on his desk, a much younger version of himself, barefoot on a church step, with a duffel bag and no future. He knew exactly what those girls were feeling. And he made a silent vow. They would never feel it again. It didn't take long for the backlash to begin. Within 48 hours of the girls arriving at the Mason estate, the whispers turned into phone calls. Then the calls turned into headlines. "Millionaire mechanic takes in stray girls, altruism or hidden motive," one tabloid blared. Reporters parked outside the gates, cameras flashing, waiting to catch even a shadow of scandal. Inside the mansion, things weren't much calmer. The live-in housekeeper, Mrs. Dozier, handed in her resignation. "I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, Mr. Mason," she said quietly as she folded her apron. "But the whole town's watching. This'll come back on you." Even Silas, his loyal driver of 15 years, seemed uncomfortable. "Sir," he said gently, "you've worked your whole life to build your name. These girls, we don't know anything about them. What if they've got baggage? Or worse?" Eldridge just stared out the window, watching the 3 girls sit silently in the backyard, bundled in mismatched sweaters. "They do have baggage, Silas. That's exactly why they're here." The lawyers were the worst. His longtime legal advisor, Harlow Winchester, a stiff, pinstripe-suited man who had guided Eldridge's business deals for over a decade, scheduled an emergency meeting. "You've put yourself at risk, Eldridge," he said, slapping a thick file onto the mahogany desk. "You're a widower, living alone in a gated mansion. You've got no experience with children, and now you're taking in 3 unrelated minors. The state is going to come down on you hard." "I'm not adopting them to impress the state." "I know. That's what makes it worse." Harlow removed his glasses, tone softening. Look, I admire what you're trying to do, but this isn't just some charity stunt. You're attaching yourself legally and emotionally to 3 trauma survivors who might never trust you. You could lose everything if one of them says the wrong thing to the wrong person. Eldridge exhaled, then looked his lawyer square in the eye. Did I ever tell you about Jasper Long? Harlow blinked. The name sounds. He was a 70-year-old mechanic who found me sleeping behind his garage when I was 16. Everyone else told him to call the cops. He fed me. Taught me to change oil, fix a carburetor, run a business. And when I got arrested for stealing bread 3 weeks later, he came to court and called me his son. Lied to the judge's face just to give me a chance. The room was silent. I was 3 seconds from disappearing, Eldridge continued, voice low. And he pulled me back. I'm not going to ignore 3 girls who are exactly where I once was. That afternoon, Eldridge drove the girls himself to the county office. With his tailored coat draped over his shoulder and the girls trailing nervously behind him, he walked straight into Child Protective Services and said, I want a file for temporary custody. The process was brutal. Home inspections. Background checks. Psychological evaluations. Endless forms. Every friend and business partner was dragged into interviews. But Eldridge never blinked. Tully barely spoke during the child psychologist's sessions, only drawing quiet little spirals in the margins of her worksheet. Zadie kept challenging everyone, pushing boundaries, stealing pens, demanding to know when she could go back to the street. And Marlo, the eldest, would just sit with her arms crossed and her face closed off, silently daring anyone to try and break her. But something else began to happen too. At night, Tully started falling asleep before midnight. Zadie began asking questions about the paintings in the hallway. And one morning, Marlo sat down across from Eldridge at breakfast and quietly asked, Do you really want us here? He met her gaze without hesitation. Yes. I do. She didn't smile. But she nodded, and that was more than enough. 4 months later, with the court's cautious approval, Eldridge Mason was officially granted custody of Tully, Zadie, and Marlo. The tabloids quieted. The headlines faded. But inside the house, something real had started to grow, something neither money nor lawyers could fake. A family. The first year was anything but easy. Though Eldridge had provided the girls with bedrooms, tutors, therapists, and anything else he could think of, healing wasn't something that could be bought or scheduled. It moved at its own slow, painful pace, and sometimes didn't move at all. Tully was the quietest. She never cried, never yelled, never asked for anything. She just observed, eyes wide and solemn, as if waiting for everything to be taken away again. Her silence was unnerving, but her mind was always active. She would take apart broken clocks, remote controls, even the toaster, just to see how things worked. One morning, Eldridge found her in the garage with the hood of his vintage Cadillac open, reading a manual 3 times her size. She looked up and said, It's your spark plugs. That's why it stalls. Zadie, by contrast, was fire and lightning. She tested boundaries constantly, sneaking out of tutoring sessions, painting on the walls, even faking stomach aches just to avoid rules. But her rebellion wasn't rooted in malice. It was fear disguised as defiance. She had been lied to and abandoned so many times that she didn't believe stability existed. One day, she told Eldridge point blank, I know you're gonna send us back eventually. They all do. He didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a canvas and some brushes, and said, Then leave a masterpiece behind before you go. She spent the next 3 days painting a swirling explosion of colors on her bedroom wall. Underneath it, she wrote, I was here. I mattered. And then there was Marlo. Marlo had seen things no child should. The oldest of the 3, she carried responsibility like armor. She woke the others for breakfast, made sure they brushed their teeth, double-checked their school bags. But she didn't let anyone get close, not the therapists, not the teachers, not Eldridge. She was polite, even respectful, but emotionally unreachable. That changed one rainy evening. Eldridge found her in the study, staring at the shelves of law books. "You read those?" she asked. "Some," he replied. "When I was trying to stay out of prison." She raised an eyebrow. "Long story," he chuckled. "Let's just say I used to be a very stupid young man." There was a pause, then she asked, "Do you think someone like me could ever be a lawyer?" He didn't hesitate. "I think someone like you could be anything." It was the first time she looked at him not with suspicion, but with curiosity. That night, she borrowed one of his books, Criminal Procedure, 5th edition, and started reading. Slowly, they each began to bloom. At school, teachers started to notice. Tully's science fair project on electrical currents earned first place. Zadie's art was submitted to a regional gallery. And Marlowe joined the debate team, then led them to their first county championship. But it wasn't the academic achievements that mattered most to Eldridge. It was the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway. The way they argued about who ate the last cookie. The birthdays celebrated with real cake and candles instead of day-old gas station cupcakes. It was the night he walked past their bedrooms and heard all three girls giggling under one blanket, watching an old VHS tape they'd found in the basement. Still, Eldridge knew better than to believe the storm had passed. Healing was a jagged path. There were still days when Tully flinched at loud noises. Nights when Zadie would cry without knowing why. Moments when Marlowe would go cold and distant, especially when asked about her past. But something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer waiting for him to leave. No longer afraid to speak. No longer surviving. They were living. And for the first time in decades, so was he. The house was full of life by the time spring came around. The girls had found their rhythm: school, tutoring, hobbies, arguments, laughter. And Eldridge? He had never been busier or more content. Morning coffee was no longer a silent ritual, it was a chaotic exchange of jokes, spilled juice, and the occasional burnt toast. The silence that once haunted his home had been replaced with piano notes from Tully, paint-stained floors from Zadie, and law books scattered like breadcrumbs in Marlowe's room. But as the jasmine bloomed along the garden walls, something else began to take root, something much darker. Eldridge had been feeling off. It started with small things. Fatigue that lingered even after a full night's rest. Sharp, unexplainable pains in his lower back. A strange yellowing in the whites of his eyes that Mrs. Dozier, now back and fiercely loyal to the girls, noticed before anyone else. He waved it off at first. Just age catching up, he joked, though he was only in his early 50s. But when he collapsed while loading groceries into the trunk of his car, the truth could no longer be avoided. The diagnosis came quickly and without mercy. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Inoperable. Aggressive. The doctor's voice was calm, clinical, too clean for the words he delivered. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mason. 6 months, maybe a year if you're lucky." Eldridge said nothing at first. Just nodded. Then thanked the doctor, walked out of the hospital, and sat in his car for nearly 2 hours in complete silence. How could he leave them? That night, he couldn't bring himself to tell the girls. He cooked dinner, smiled through their stories, and laughed when Zadie accidentally dumped an entire bottle of pepper into the pasta. But the moment they went to bed, he sat at his desk and began writing. Letter after letter. One for each of them. He told Tully how proud he was of her quiet brilliance, how she saw the world in systems and solutions, and how he saw in her the engineer of the future. He told Zadie that her wildness was not a flaw, but a gift, a kind of fire that could light up the darkness in others, if she learned how to use it with love instead of fear. He told Marlowe that she was already stronger than most adults he had met, and that justice didn't require a perfect past, only a fearless heart. And then, finally, he wrote a letter to all three of them, folded it carefully, and placed it in a sealed envelope labeled, "For when I'm gone." But Eldridge wasn't finished yet. He called his financial advisor. Rewrote his will. Established a trust fund for each girl, not just money, but support for their education, housing, and future careers. He contacted Jasper Long's widow, a woman who once treated him like a stray dog and ended up calling him son. He asked her to look out for the girls if anything ever happened. Then, and only then, did he sit them down. They were confused at first. Marlo immediately grew tense, her arms folded protectively. Tully stared at the floor. Zadie rolled her eyes. What now? Another life lesson. Eldridge took a deep breath. "I'm sick," he said softly. "Really sick." Silence fell over the room like a curtain. "What kind of sick?" Marlo asked. Her voice wasn't trembling, it was steel. "The kind that doesn't go away." None of them spoke. Zadie's smirk faded completely. Tully's face crumpled. "I don't want you to be scared," he continued. "And I don't want you to feel like you're alone. Because you're not. You have each other. And I will always be with you, even if not in this house." "But you said you weren't going to leave," Tully said, her voice shaking. "I meant it," Eldridge said, leaning forward. "Even when I'm gone, part of me stays. In every choice you make. In every person you help. In every time you look in the mirror and remember who you are." They sat with him until midnight. No one cried. Not yet. They just sat there, leaning on each other. And for the first time since the day they arrived, the girls understood the cost of love. It was never safe. It was never easy. But it was always worth it. The days following Eldridge's revelation moved in slow motion. Everything looked the same, the towering bookshelves, the hum of the housekeeper's vacuum, the scent of lemon polish in the hallways, but the air had changed. Every sound felt louder. Every silence, heavier. The girls reacted differently. Tully retreated inward. She stopped playing piano. Stopped talking during dinner. Instead, she sat in her room with open textbooks and sketchpads, scribbling notes and diagrams, as though solving equations could keep death from touching their doorstep. One night, Eldridge found her in the garage again, working on a rusted old radio. "You think if you fix enough broken things, you'll fix me too?" he asked gently. She didn't look up. "I can try." Zadie became angry. Not screaming or lashing out, but quietly furious. She painted obsessively, covering every inch of canvas she could find. Her colors grew darker, her lines more chaotic. "You said forever," she muttered one evening, staring at a nearly finished painting that looked like a house unraveling in the wind. "You brought us here and made us believe in forever." Eldridge sat beside her, not saying anything, just watching as she dipped her brush again and again into black paint until the whole canvas disappeared. Marlo, true to her nature, tried to take control. She requested meetings with Eldridge's doctors, printed medical journals, highlighted alternative treatments, diets, clinical trials. She created a binder, thick and meticulously labeled, titled Plan for Dad. He smiled when he saw it. "You know this can't be argued out of me like a courtroom case." Marlo didn't smile back. "Then we appeal." Still, through the grief and the fear, the Mason household held on to a rhythm. Eldridge insisted they keep living. He showed Tully how to change brake pads on the Mercedes. Taught Zadie how to make his mother's cornbread recipe, burnt edges and all, he'd joke. And with Marlo, he would sit in the study at night, listening to her read legal articles aloud. "You've got a voice made for justice," he told her once. "People will listen when you speak, just make sure what you say is worth hearing." Summer passed into fall. Eldridge's strength began to wane. He lost weight. Walked slower. Slept longer. But he never let them see his pain, not fully. His pride wouldn't allow it. Then came the morning he didn't come down for breakfast. It was Zadie who knocked first. No answer. Then Marlowe tried. Nothing. Tully unlocked the door with the emergency key they kept taped behind the hallway mirror. They found him asleep in his chair by the window, a blanket over his lap, and a letter resting on his chest. He was alive, just barely, his breath shallow, skin pale. He was rushed to the hospital. Hooked to machines, surrounded by a flurry of nurses and quiet doctors who spoke in somber tones. The girls sat in the waiting room for hours, none of them speaking. Their roles had reversed now, they weren't children anymore. They were protectors. And he was the one fading. When the doctor approached with that look, the look that confirms what your heart already knows, it was Marlowe who stood up first. "You said he had more time." The doctor hesitated. "We're doing everything we can." "Not enough," Zadie snapped, tears spilling over. Tully simply closed her eyes, a single sob escaping her lips like a breath she'd held too long. That night, the hospital allowed them into his room one by one. Marlowe sat by his side and whispered, "You made me believe in right and wrong again. You made me strong." Zadie clutched his hand and whispered, "You made me seen. No one ever did that before you." Tully, smallest of them all, kissed his forehead and said, "You didn't fix us, Dad. You rebuilt us." And though Eldridge could no longer speak, a single tear rolled down his cheek. He passed away just before dawn. The funeral was held a week later. It was massive, more than 400 people. Not because he was rich, but because he had touched so many lives. Former employees, children from broken homes he had quietly funded scholarships for, recovering addicts from local shelters he supported anonymously. One by one, they stood and spoke of what he meant to them. But it was the girls, now young women, who stood last. Marlowe stood tall and addressed the crowd. "You knew him as a businessman. We knew him as a father. He didn't save us, he chose us. And then taught us how to choose ourselves." They buried him beneath an oak tree on the edge of the estate, the one he used to sit under every Sunday morning with his coffee and the girls curled around him like cats. He was gone. But everything he had poured into them, all the love, patience, pain, and hope, was very much alive. And deep inside each of them, something had begun to stir. A promise. A plan. Something that would shake the world. The years that followed were a blur of milestones, heartbreak, and transformation. After Eldridge's death, the estate felt hollow, like a grand shell echoing with memories. The girls, no, the young women, refused to let it become a mausoleum. They stayed for a while, finishing school and caring for the home he'd built for them, but each of them knew in their bones, they had a bigger mission. Something that went beyond mourning. They carried his final letter everywhere. It was a short note, written in his careful, slightly slanted handwriting. "If you ever want to repay me, don't. Just continue the chain. There's always someone else who needs a hand, the same way I needed one. The same way you did. Pass it forward. With all my love, Dad." That sentence didn't just stick. It ignited them. Marlowe was the first to leave. She applied, and got accepted, to Yale Law. It was grueling, intense, competitive, but she never flinched. Every essay, every class debate, every mock trial she won was in honor of the man who once told her that justice wasn't about perfection, it was about courage. By her final year, she had already interned with a civil rights nonprofit and drafted legislation to protect abused minors in state care. When a news station did a segment on her work, they titled it, "From Homeless to Harvard of the Law, The Rise of Marlowe Mason." She didn't care about the fame. But she did make sure the anchor got Eldridge's name right. Zadie stayed in Savannah longer. She needed time, needed space, needed color. She turned the upstairs study into an art studio, the white walls soaked with paint. Her therapy came in the form of brush strokes, some furious, others soft, like memory turned to motion. Eventually, she submitted a piece to a gallery in Atlanta. A massive canvas called Unchosen Girls, showing three faceless girls reaching toward a house made of light. It sold within hours. But Zadie didn't stop at art. She launched a foundation, the EM Collective, named after Eldridge. Its mission: provide arts education and therapy to foster youth and children who'd survived trauma. Her gallery openings became fundraising events. Her social media exploded. She became a voice for kids who'd never had one. Tully, always the quiet thinker, did something no one expected. She got into MIT at 17. Her focus: bioengineering. Her passion: solving rare metabolic diseases in children, conditions that often went untreated because they were not profitable for major pharmaceutical companies. She worked tirelessly, often falling asleep in labs, living off coffee and notebooks. By 22, she had co-created a protein therapy that extended the lives of children with a rare genetic condition. She named the project Project Spark, in honor of a simple moment when Eldridge once told her she had a spark that could power the world, if she chose to use it. But their most powerful decision came when they finally reunited, 5 years after Eldridge's death. It was a gray November morning. They met at the old house, which had stood untouched for too long, covered in ivy and dust. But instead of sadness, there was clarity between them. They had an idea, one that none of them could ignore anymore. They would transform the estate into something living, breathing, and eternal. They called it the Eldridge House, a residential and educational center for displaced girls. A safe haven for those lost in the cracks of the system. It would offer shelter, education, therapy, and even career training. It would be everything they never had, until one man decided they mattered. It took months of planning, legal work, permits, grant applications. Marlowe handled all the legal documents. Tully oversaw the technology, security, and infrastructure. Zadie designed every inch of the interior, warm, bold, and unapologetically creative. And when they opened the doors for the first time, standing in front of a crowd of donors, social workers, former foster kids, and even state officials, Zadie stood before the podium and spoke. Her voice cracked, but she smiled. He didn't save us with money. He saved us by choosing us. By seeing us. And today, we choose to see others. To carry on the chain. The applause was thunderous. That night, as they stood beneath the oak tree that shaded their father's grave, Marlowe whispered, "We did it, Dad." Tully placed her hand on the tree's trunk. Zadie looked up at the stars. And for the first time since his death, they didn't cry. They smiled. Because the chain hadn't broken. It had only just begun. The grand opening of the Eldridge House sent ripples far beyond the borders of Savannah. Local news outlets covered it first, then regional stations picked it up. But it wasn't until a national journalist from a major network visited the center, initially planning a small human interest piece, that the story caught fire. The article was titled, "3 Girls, 1 Man, and the Legacy That Changed Everything." Within days, the segment aired on primetime television. Footage showed the sisters giving a tour through the restored mansion, now converted into a state-of-the-art facility. The main hallway was filled with portraits of foster youth, all smiling, each with their story briefly noted underneath. There were therapy rooms with soft colors, a reading room that resembled a sun-drenched library, art studios, science labs, and even a mock courtroom where Marlowe held confidence-building workshops for teenage girls. The response was overwhelming. Donations flooded in. Letters arrived from around the country. People shared stories of their own foster care journeys, their traumas, and their gratitude for someone finally shining a light on the system's forgotten children. Eldridge's story touched a nerve, not because he was rich, but because he chose to care when it wasn't convenient. What none of the girls expected, however, was the attention from Washington, D.C. 2 weeks after the broadcast, they received a formal letter from the White House, inviting them to attend a private event honoring civilians who had made extraordinary contributions to social reform. At first, they thought it was a scam, until a follow-up call came directly from the Office of Public Engagement. Marlowe paced the room while holding the phone. "The president wants to meet with us," she asked in disbelief. Tully blinked. "Do we have to wear suits?" Zadie grinned. "Can I paint mine?" They flew to D.C. quietly, without announcing it to the press. Upon arrival, they were escorted into a private room of the East Wing, where they met high-ranking officials, members of Congress, and eventually, the president herself. The woman greeted them warmly, shaking each hand with genuine care. "I've followed your story. But more importantly, I've followed your impact," she said. "You've not only honored your father's legacy, you've started a movement." She presented them with a Presidential Humanitarian Achievement Award, something rarely given, especially to civilians under 30. Marlowe accepted it on behalf of the three. "We didn't plan this to be a movement," she said. "We just didn't want anyone else to feel invisible the way we once did." What followed was nothing short of explosive. Major publications scrambled for interviews. Talk shows sent invitations. Documentarians requested filming access to the Eldridge house. And while the sisters gave a few carefully selected interviews, they agreed on one thing: their priority was the work, not the spotlight. Still, the spotlight came anyway. Universities began to partner with the center. Scholarships were created in Eldridge's name. Zadie's artwork was featured in a Smithsonian Youth exhibit titled Rewritten Futures. Tully was asked to speak at global science summits about accessible medicine and innovation in underfunded communities. But none of that compared to the real moment that shook them, when a bus pulled into the driveway of the Eldridge house late one rainy afternoon. Out stepped a social worker, holding the hands of 3 young girls. They were almost a mirror of the past, one quiet and observant, one defiant and bold, and one protective, mature beyond her years. Zadie was the first to walk outside. She knelt down to their level and smiled. "Welcome home," she said. "We've been waiting for you." Behind her, Tully opened the front doors. Marlowe stood in the lobby, holding a fresh set of pajamas and toothbrushes. Every corner of the house was ready. And as the new girls stepped inside, wide-eyed and unsure, the sisters exchanged a look they didn't need to explain. This was the repayment Eldridge had never asked for, the real kind. The living kind. The kind that would outlive them all. Years passed. The Eldridge house didn't just thrive, it multiplied. What started as a single home became a national network. Centers opened in Chicago, Houston, Detroit, and Phoenix. Each followed the same model: safe housing, creative and academic development, legal support, therapy, and, most importantly, unconditional love. It was revolutionary not because it was complicated, but because it was real. And at the center of it all, the sisters, Marlowe, Zadie, and Tully, remained deeply involved. Marlowe became a federal judge by 35, the youngest in her circuit. Yet, despite the robe and the courtroom, she still taught weekend law classes at the original Eldridge house, mentoring teens who'd once been told they'd never make it past high school. Zadie opened a full-time art institute inside the Savannah campus. Her pieces now hung in galleries across Europe and Asia, but she still painted alongside the kids every Thursday afternoon. Tully, now a globally recognized scientist, directed a nonprofit pharmaceutical lab partnered with the center, providing life-saving medicine to children across the U.S. for free. Her innovations had won awards, but she never missed the yearly science fair at Eldridge House. On the 18th anniversary of Eldridge's death, the sisters returned once more to Savannah for a memorial service held under the great oak tree where he was buried. Hundreds gathered, former foster youth, now grown and thriving, along with their children. Teachers, judges, social workers, and families whose lives had been changed by a man they'd never met. A stage was built at the base of the tree. Marlowe stepped forward to speak, holding the original letter Eldridge had left them. "I once thought the greatest thing he gave us was a home," she began, her voice steady. "But it wasn't the house. It was the belief that we were worthy of one. That someone could look at 3 broken kids and see potential, not pity." Zadie followed her. "I was angry for a long time. Not at him, at the world. I thought love was a trick. But he proved me wrong. He taught me love isn't always soft. Sometimes it's showing up. Over and over. Even when it's hard." Then Tully stepped up, quieter than the others, but her words carried weight. "He said to keep the chain going. So we did. And we're not done." After the speeches, a plaque was unveiled at the base of the tree. "In memory of Eldridge Mason. Father by choice. Builder of legacies. His love lives in every life changed." As the sun began to set, the girls, now women, now leaders, stood hand in hand. The wind rustled the branches above them, the same tree under which they once buried the man who gave them everything. But this time, there was no grief. There was only peace. And pride. And the quiet, thunderous knowledge that the chain Eldridge started hadn't just continued, it had become unbreakable. One of the younger girls from the home tugged at Marlowe's sleeve. "Is it true you were just like me?" she asked. Marlowe knelt down and smiled. "No," she whispered. "We're just like you." And somewhere, in the laughter of the children, in the walls of every center bearing his name, and in every brave decision made by someone once broken, Eldridge Mason lived on. Forever. In the end, this story isn't just about a millionaire or 3 homeless girls, it's about the quiet power of choosing love when it's inconvenient, when it costs something, when the world tells you to look away. Eldridge Mason didn't change the world with a grand gesture or a viral act of charity. He changed it by seeing value in the unseen, by offering consistency where there had only been abandonment. What makes this story so powerful is not just the transformation of the girls, but the way they took the pain they were handed and turned it into purpose. That's the real legacy. Not wealth, not fame, but impact, measurable in lives restored, dreams reignited, and futures rewritten. It reminds us that real change doesn't always start with institutions or systems. Sometimes, it starts with one person deciding that someone else's life is worth investing in. And if more people followed that lead, just one life at a time, who knows how many chains of hope we could create. This is a story of redemption, of healing, and of how love, when chosen fiercely and fearlessly, can echo for generations.